Okay, so really we just about finished. What we thought we'd do just for the last half hour, 20 minutes, half hour, is just give you some ideas on, first of all, our sort of initial insights and conclusions of some of the big things that we've been talking about, but also what our next steps are, and ways of trying to take some of our analysis and ideas forward. And there's nothing necessarily new here that we haven't looked at already. It's really just to bring it together. So where are we? This is a deliberate photograph. This is an analogy that myself and Basil came up with about a year ago to actually say, well, okay, then if lesson study is about trying to help people understand learning, where have we got to? And the kind of analogy that we started to use is that we feel, in terms of understanding learning, we feel like we're on a boat looking at the shoreline on a really foggy day. And that we feel as if we can sort of see little bits of the landscape. We feel as if we can sort of begin to possibly work out what the landscape in general looks like, but we certainly can't see any detail. We feel as if perhaps we're getting little glimpses that some of that fog is beginning to clear away, that we're getting a better idea of what this sort of learning landscape looks like. But we've actually almost sort of resigned ourselves to the fact that the fog will never absolutely clear. That actually, you know, it will be great fun trying, but ultimately we're looking at something so complex, something so flexible, something that is ever changing, that the landscape will never be a crystal clear landscape. But we'll just keep chipping away at trying to see more and more of it as we go along. So where do we think we're at? We would argue that actually the practical utility for us is certain. The amount of engagement we've had with people, our own use of lesson study, there seems to be a huge amount of belief, and it is a belief system to a certain extent, that it does have a huge amount of utility, but you can't necessarily pin it down. In fact, it's Fernandez, I think it is, isn't it, who would argue sort of don't even try to sort of nail it down to the floor. Just enjoy the wave, enjoy the experience of doing it, because that's all that's important. I suppose it's coming from that sort of American pragmatic movement, where if it's working, don't question it too much. So we are very, very secure in our own belief that it does have a huge amount of practical utility. However, having said that, one of the things that I think it's fair to say, are really enjoying is trying to really bring that sort of critical analysis and understanding to parts of it, to really begin, not just to accept that this is wonderful and we'll just carry on doing it and everybody's happy, but to actually really begin to take a critical stance on elements of it. And the one that we started doing now, as we suggested before, is this whole idea of observation. You know, how do you do it? How do you maximise the amount out of it? Are there different ways of observing that are better for different contexts, depending on what we're looking at? And one of the reasons we've chosen this is because within the very loose reading that we've done so far, we're now doing it in a far more systematic way. As we suggested again before, there is very, very little of detail in the literature about how people do it and what they get from it and how it actually informs the analysis. The ever-present part of learning, it's a very long job, but I'm now doing a very close reading of Kinnerly-Leris. So I'm going through each chapter, and as I go through each chapter, every time I come across a piece of work from somebody else that I think is important, I'm getting hold of their literature and moving into that, which is going to be a hell of a long task. You know, I've accepted it's going to take a very long period of time, because I'm looking potentially at the work of probably 30, 40 different theorists, huge amount of work to read, but I want to spend that time slowly developing and accruing a deeper and broader view of what learning is. And I think the reason I want to do that is that there is far too much that I've come across recently in education of people sort of championing one view of learning. You know, it's all about cognitive, you know, it's all about neuroscience, it's all about memory and the hardwiring of facts into the brain. You get other people, oh no, it's all about socio-cultural. One of the things I love about Kinodi Leris is that he's actually putting his hand up and saying, yeah, it's all of those. But it's actually how they all interrelate one to the other. It's not just selecting one bit and saying that's what's important. And then the other thing that I think we've sort of started to really, for ourselves as HE practitioners, is I think we have really started to just think about and enjoy the level of professional learning that's going on. Again, it's difficult to capture, especially because we're doing it ourselves, and sort of analysing yourself is always going to be a very difficult thing. But it's obvious that it does have a huge amount of potential for professional learning. And you know, as just being, it has been such an enjoyable experience. It's been time pressured on occasion, you know, sort of there are periods, especially when the PGCE students have been at the same time as we've been doing this, where it's sort of 5:30 on a Thursday evening. It's really a case of, well, I'd rather go home actually, rather than sit here for another 3/4 of an hour and discuss what we're going to do next week around some effective teaching. But it has been really good fun. So just to finish off with what the next steps, we're now really beginning to try to analyse some of the data and to begin to really clarify some of our own thinking on this idea of the pedagogic black box. To really begin to build some kind of model around notions of discussion and debate around teaching and learning, and understanding how that opens up our understanding of pedagogy within groups. And we've got a lot of evidence of that in the transcripts, but it's pulling it out and making a decent critical story out of it.
You coined that phrase.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to put your name next to that.
Hopefully it'll be in a book later on this year, if it gets published. One of the other things that we've done, or certainly that I've sort of started to do quite a lot on, in a parallel series of discussions, I've started doing some work on solo taxonomy, which is a way of understanding levels of learning. The whole idea is looking at the level of understanding that people have in learning within a particular area of knowledge. So the idea is that the sort of the language that's used alongside it is the idea that people start off at what's called pre-structural. In other words, they don't know anything, and then they begin to sort of understand one idea, one concept, and knowledge around that. It is knowledge-based, and that's sort of unistructural. When people start getting 2 or 3 ideas about something, but they don't necessarily connect them, they're sort of free-floating, it's multi-structural. If they then start linking them all together, so they start getting a more holistic, critical view of a body of knowledge and the concepts which underlie it, it's relational, and then something called extended abstract, where you can use that then to predict and theorise and extend that into new areas. And I've been doing some work, well, funnily enough, yesterday afternoon I did a 2-hour session with the humanities faculty at a local school who are thinking of taking this on to run their department by, in terms of planning and assessment and so on and so forth. What's really interesting with solo taxonomy is that right at the centre of it, my interpretation of it is that right at the centre of it is the idea of a language for learning. So actually listening to learners very carefully to see how they're constructing their answers and their knowledge. And what I found myself doing in a couple of observations I've done for ITE, lesson study over the last couple of months with my students, is I'll be sitting in an observation and I'll be focusing on a couple of kids who are talking, and I feel as if I'm understanding the discussion that they're having in a far clearer way, because actually I've got a framework in my own mind about how they're actually conceptualising and using those and building them and developing that knowledge and the concepts on which they sort of sit within the discussions that they're having, which has been absolutely fantastic.
Janet came to talk to Teach First people about a particular way of teaching maths, and solo taxonomy really influences that, so that you want people to be able to use mathematical concepts relationally, so they can make choices about the kinds of calculations that they're doing, and it takes it away from that uni structure, this is the way I do fractions, to actually having a working language.
Yeah.
And it's really transformative in
Yeah.
terms of having growing mathematicians as opposed to people who can do mathematical functions. So that's a really, because I was struggling with it a bit, and it's that, thinking about it in terms of maths really helped me to
Yeah.
get a much broader sense of how it functions.
But it's also a framework to assess the development of the students, which is really useful because it helps for observations.
Well, we were talking about question and answer. You know, it potentially has a huge amount of utility as far as I'm concerned in listening carefully to what a kid's saying to you in an answer. So that rather than throwing back some relatively vague questions that are asking them to build on, you've got a very clear framework in your mind, right, okay then, yeah, you've got one idea in there. Okay then, have you got any other ideas you could add to that? Alright, well if you've got those two ideas, how can you start linking, you know, do they link together or are they totally separate? So it gives you potentially a way of really extending out kids' thinking, but it's all based on you being very attentive to what they're actually saying and how they're constructing their answers.
It's a way for struggling ITE students to think about building a genuine learning narrative in the lesson as well. This seems to some level, how do you build the books and how do you build it? How are you relating this to a wider scheme of the students?
One of the things that I do at IT, have done for about 3 years now, is I have a thing that I call a progressional planning sheet, which is an A3 sheet of paper and it has 6 lesson columns on it. And I was finding problems with IT where people would plan a lesson and then plan another lesson. Each one was an event. And I just said, right, what I want you to do is outline plan 6 lessons at a time with your learning objectives, with the basic content, so that you can see how those lessons are all going to progress one after the other. And I've added an extra row in this year, which is what kind of levels within Solo are you actually planning for, and how are you progressing them through their learning through those levels. Now they may operate at a higher or lower level than that in the lesson, but at least it's getting people to think about how they're developing that sort of cognitive challenge as they go through. And therefore, sort of the way that I see us using it potentially here is actually, as I say, in observations, unlocking the kids' learning to a greater degree by understanding far more critically the dialogue that's going on between them. You know, what kind of level dialogue have we got? How is it developing? We're also working on trying to put lesson study in a wider context, so that it's not just sort of some kind of funny little method that you use because it seems to work. Putting it in a wider sort of, I suppose, sort of policy, sociological context in a sense. I'm giving a paper at a conference up in York on this in July. And I don't know how many of you have read Hargreaves and Fulham's book on professional capital. We think it's a really fantastic. It's let down at the end because actually the practical application of it is a little bit thin. But actually as a model it's really interesting. And they argue that ultimately the way education is going in one of 2 ways really. One is sort of a business capital model of education, which is about, you know, data and quantitative approaches to education and teachers as deliverers, you know, sort of your sort of school in a box kind of approach where sort of some big corporate sort of parachutes and everything, you need to deliver it. And they're obviously quite scathing about that. But they argue that the best way really of taking the teaching profession forward is to create this notion of professional capital. And professional capital is a model for giving people that professionalism and giving people the opportunity to develop as teachers. And they argue that there's 3 elements to it. Human capital, which is actually about the capital of the individual. How do you aid teachers in becoming better professionals, more professional, giving them that status as a very highly skilled individual who is doing this job. And therefore they talk about the idea of, you know, structured CPD, the idea of opportunities for teachers as individuals to expand their repertoire, to engage in sort of practitioner inquiry or research or whatever you're going to call it, to make themselves better as teachers. But also, in addition to that, the idea of social capital. And the idea in their mind of social capital is this idea of collaboration, but not contrived collaboration, not SLT or senior managers coming into a meeting sort of saying you will do, and you'll do it in these groups and you'll focus on this thing. It's actually about a bottom-up model. It's actually about groups of teachers engaging with things and engaging with ideas and developing ideas that have meaning for them and are important for them in developing their work. And then they also argue that the final part of this is this notion of decisional capital. That actually if professionalism means anything, you have to give room and time for people on the ground, in classrooms, as groups, to make proper decisions. That don't all have to then be sort of submitted in triplicate back through to the people who run the organisation to get it rubber stamped and to be told that that's okay. That actually you're trusted as a professional to make those decisions to make teaching and learning better. And they argue that if all of those three things are happening together, then you're creating this idea of professional capital. We're not saying that lesson study is professional capital, but it is a useful vehicle for actually allowing that to happen. In all of those ways, it's about individuals bringing stuff to the table and getting insights and improving their own practice in an authentically collaborative way, and they're making the decisions about that practice and how to improve it. So as a delivery mechanism for professional capital, we see lesson study as being an ideal way of doing that. Again, we're not saying it's the only one, but it has a huge amount of potential for developing the professional capital of teachers. And then I suppose I had to finish here. Would be a surprise if I didn't really. Is this idea of complexity theory and emergence. What we've come up time and time again with when we've been discussing this is that actually, in a sense, the destination, will we ever get that landscape completely clear, almost becomes unimportant. Because actually it's the journey, it's the process that is actually what is really engaging and is improving what we're doing and giving us new insights. And that journey is one that has gone through lots of turns. It's gone off on side roads in a lot of the projects that we've done, because actually what we're finding out is an emergent thing. And you sometimes uncover things that you didn't expect and you go off on a new tangent. And therefore, what we haven't done is to sort of go down this sort of atrophied action research sort of channel that some people do, where it's a case of, right, I am going to look at this, and I'm only going to look at this, and this is the only thing that we're interested in. The archetypal one is questioning. I've got to make questioning better, so I'm only going to look at questioning. And we go through a couple of cycles, and we try and make questioning better, and then at the end we sort of see whether it's better or not, and then we move on to something else. This is far more holistic. It's about trying to play with the complexity of the classroom. It's about trying to just sort of accept that complexity and play with it and allow new insights and practice to emerge as we go through that. So one of my jobs for this next 12 months is to try and really engage with some of the literature within lesson study in a slightly different way, to work with the stuff I already know in complexity theory, to try and begin to build some kind of conceptual model, do some writing really around how potentially we can see lesson study as this sort of way of working with complexity and emergence. But what I like about it is that it makes that complexity exciting and positive rather than baffling, and gives us a tool to really sort of play with it and do something useful with it. So I think that's sort of where we're at. Any sort of last questions or sort of comments at all before we finish? We hope it's been useful. Any questions?
I think one of the thing about professional capital is really important. At a time when I certainly feel my agency as a professional has been undermined all the time, that to be able to do something that has practical utility but also engages with really complex and fascinating ideas about something as complex and fascinating as a classroom. It's really fabulous, actually. I want to do it just for me to feel less cross about working.
Yeah. It's quite interesting because it unlocks pedagogy in a way I think hasn't been done before. Well, might have been pre-Bowden, I don't know. But certainly post-strategies, post-national curriculum, when everything was imposed and highly visible and highly structured. And we, the strategies were developed with telling teachers how to teach as well as what to teach and when to teach it really. And in a way so teachers haven't had to think about pedagogy and haven't really necessarily even been taught about pedagogy in a way. And this unlocks it, and I think that, picking up on Ingrid's professional point really, that kind of does empower you to be a professional rather than just to be government.
Well, just on that, in the ITE project, not in this one, because we're both anarchists really, and we have a lot of freedom. You do, in higher education, you've got a lot of freedom, actually. We ought to be very grateful for that in one way. I take Ingrid's point about the pressures with them. In the transcripts, I haven't analysed them all yet systematically, but in the transcripts of planning meetings between training and mentor in school, it's quite remarkable what kind of structures emerge from those planning meetings. So some of them are right, what are the objectives? Bang, objectives. What's the starter? 10 minutes on the starter. What's the main part of the lesson? 15 minutes discussion about that, and they agree that. Right, now we'll do our plenary. And it follows a very structured, laid down format from the strategies. I think that came from the strategy about 10 years ago. That started
it's a government initiative.
That came. Yeah. Another one that we've seen in a CPD project that we did, the first pilot we did in the school, it was TEEP. The model was something called TEEP. Unless you understood TEEP, which is, tell me what TEEP is.
It's basically
it's a
lesson structure, which is connect, activate, demonstrate, consolidate as phases of lesson.
And unless you understand that, you can't understand the transcript. I had to go and Google TEEP, when I was listening. What on earth are they doing? I had to go and look at this. And then I learned it was initiated in 1998 and this kind of thing, and it's got these. And of course, that then has morphed several times. So there are different versions of that. So again, not even knowing that, you've got to understand this particular school's context. But even without a chair of the meeting, the meeting transcript, I can divide into stanzas according to those things. Not question at all. Nobody challenges, well, for this learning challenge that we've got to deal with, is this the best structure? They just assume that it fits into them. Another one you find in ITE is it's totally chaotic, or it appears to be. They get all these ideas, and then they say, where's the lesson plan? And they get hold of the lesson plan, and everything then is kind of shoveled into its parts. But there's a lesson plan format in the school. It's quite uncanny. I think we'll be able to come up with a typology of meeting structures. I can't guarantee that, so I've not done them all. But one of the things we're doing is dividing them into stanzas. And there is one school which is totally chaotic, where after about 15 minutes they just said, what are we trying to do here? They then have a short bit where they decide what they're going to do, and then they go back to the kind of free-for-all. But I've only come across one where the planning meeting is a kind of free-for-all. Everything else has got this underpinning structures which have been given to them, and there's lot into it. It's quite uncanny. But that'll have to wait. I mean, I've got provisional things I'm talking about tomorrow.
I think the other thing that has been really interesting is that in a number of setup meetings that we've had, we've said to people there is no time limit on this.
No.
don't feel that you have to do a cycle saying 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 2 weeks. Take as long as you want, because it's the quality of the discussion that matters. And you see someone short-circuiting. Well, because all of their work has time limits to it. So we sort of said to one group, they said, well, how long should this take? And I said, well, in this half term, try to do 2 cycles if you can. But if you don't get a chance and you only do 1, that's fine. And it was sort of like, really? So I said, yeah, absolutely no problem whatsoever. Oh right, okay. And trying to get people to understand this idea of slowing down the rate of change. And it's about the quality of what you do, the quality of the discussion, having a full debate so that as you move forward you've got an understanding as to why and how it's all going to work, rather than just trying to gallop through it. Actually, for some people, is quite a big shift. Because again, it's this idea about professional capital, it's about the quality of what you're doing rather than the quantity. And I think for that's 15 years? We've had a quantity model, which as a consequence means that nothing has really ever changed. Because people have worked out that if you just sort of do the paperwork, put it in, they'll be on to the next thing next week. So you can get away without really engaging. Just last comment. On the back sheet of this sort of little booklet on lesson study, there is a thing here, a website address. We have now got a Leicester Lesson Study website. It's fairly embryonic at the moment. We're going to hopefully add a load more stuff to it in the next 2 or 3 weeks, but we're beginning to distill a load of our thinking onto that website. It's got links to other resources as well. A copy of that booklet will go on there, and when we've got to send a report to the HEA by the end of this month. If everybody's left their email address on the register next door, if you haven't, if you want to stick it down, then what we'll do is, as a matter of course, we'll send a copy of the report we sent to the HEA to everybody who's been here today, but we'll probably stick it up on our website as well. So that's the sort of growing, intentionally that's sort of a growing repository of what we do.
I don't know whether on the SES project we have to do a similar
Yeah.
That's okay, but I just wonder whether, particularly when we're working in schools, if you want us to send us that project report. Once it's done.
Like I say, we'll have an SES report on ITE sometime in
That's
September.
6 months, isn't it?
So we can send that through as well. Yes, yeah, why not? Yeah. Brilliant.
You're the first people.
Thanks ever so much.